Vienna, Austria, September 2019. Something extraordinary was about to happen in the concert hall of the prestigious Mozarteum University. A 9-year-old American boy, Samuel Bennett, sat down at the piano. As his small hands touched the keys, the music professors in the hall held their breath. The child began to play Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 in C major. But that wasn't the shocking part. Samuel had never received formal piano training. Even more bizarre, after his performance, he turned to the professors and said, "I played in this room 250 years ago too. Back then, the walls were a different color." How can a child perfectly play music he never learned? How does he know the architectural details of 18th century Vienna? And most importantly, how can he describe the private life, the pain, and even the death of one of history's greatest composers in such detail? Welcome to Reincarnation Chronicles, where we explore real cases of children who remember past lives. If you're curious about the mysteries of reincarnation, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin. Samuel Bennett was born on January 27, 2010, in Portland, Oregon. His parents, Michael and Jennifer Bennett, were ordinary middle-class Americans. Michael worked as a civil engineer, and Jennifer was a high school literature teacher. They had no particular interest in classical music. Their home had no piano, no violin, no musical instruments of any kind. The Bennetts were more interested in hiking and outdoor activities than concert halls. Samuel was their second child. Nothing in the Bennett family's background suggested that their son would become one of the most fascinating cases in reincarnation. Research. There were no child prodigies in their family tree. No famous musicians, no connection to European classical music culture. But from the moment Samuel could speak, something was different about him. Very different. When Samuel was just 2 years old, he started humming complex melodies. Jennifer initially thought he was mimicking songs from children's TV shows, but these weren't simple nursery rhymes. These were intricate, sophisticated musical phrases that seemed to come from nowhere. Years later, music historians would identify them as fragments of Mozart's lesser-known compositions. By age 3, Samuel's behavior became increasingly unusual. He would sit in front of the television when classical music programs aired, completely transfixed. Samuel would watch entire symphony performances without moving, tears sometimes streaming down his face. When Jennifer asked him why he was crying, he said something that gave her chills. "The music makes me remember when I was big." The Bennetts didn't own a piano, but Samuel's grandmother had an old upright piano in her living room. During a family visit when Samuel was 3.5, something incredible happened. The adults were in the kitchen preparing dinner when they heard piano music coming from the living room. Not random banging on keys like you'd expect from a toddler. Actual music. Melodic, structured, beautiful music. They rushed to the living room and found Samuel sitting at the piano, his tiny fingers moving across the keys with purpose. He was playing a simplified version of a Mozart minuet. Michael and Jennifer stood frozen in the doorway. Their son had never touched a piano before. No one had taught him. Yet there he was, playing music that sounded like it came from another century. "Samuel, how do you know how to do that?" Jennifer asked, her voice shaking. Samuel turned around with a confused expression. "I just know, Mommy. I've always known. I played this when I was grown up before." Michael and Jennifer exchanged worried glances. This seemed different. This was tangible. This was real music being played by hands that shouldn't know how to play anything. Over the next few months, Samuel's obsession with piano grew. He would draw pictures of himself sitting at a grand piano, wearing strange clothes. Knee breeches, a jacket with tails, and what looked like a white powdered wig. When Jennifer asked him about the drawings, he said, "This is what I wore when I played for the kings and queens." The Bennetts decided to rent a small keyboard for Samuel. The moment the keyboard arrived, Samuel's face lit up. He sat down and began to play. Not simple songs, not basic children's melodies. He played complex pieces with both hands, with dynamics, with expression that seemed impossible for a child his age. Jennifer pulled out her phone and started recording. She posted one video on her personal Facebook page with the caption, "Our 4-year-old has never had a lesson, but he plays like this. Can anyone explain this?" The video went viral in their local community. Within days, music teachers from across Portland were reaching out, offering free lessons, wanting to meet this mysterious child prodigy. One of those teachers was Dr. Patricia Morrison, a respected piano instructor who had taught at the Portland Conservatory for 30 years. She agreed to meet Samuel, more out of curiosity than anything else. The way the child's hands moved, the phrasing, the musical maturity, it seemed impossible for someone so young. Dr. Morrison arrived at the Bennett home on a rainy October afternoon in 2014. She brought sheet music ranging from simple to intermediate difficulty. She wanted to test Samuel's sight-reading ability. What happened next would change Dr. Morrison's understanding of musical ability forever. She placed a piece of sheet music in front of Samuel, a Mozart Sonata K545, commonly known as Sonata Facile. It was far beyond what a 4-year-old should be able to comprehend. Samuel looked at the music for a moment, a strange expression crossing his face. Then he said something that made Dr. Morrison's blood run cold. "I wrote this when I was older, in my other life. I wrote this for my students, for the people who were just learning." Dr. Morrison tried to maintain her professional composure, but her hands were trembling. "Can you play it, Samuel?" The boy nodded and began to play. Not haltingly, not with the mistakes you'd expect from someone sight-reading for the first time. He played it perfectly, with the exact phrasing and dynamics that Mozart himself might have intended. More than that, he played it with an emotional depth that seasoned concert pianists spent years trying to achieve. When he finished, there was silence in the room. Michael and Jennifer stood in the doorway, tears in their eyes. Dr. Morrison sat down heavily in a chair. In her 3 decades of teaching, she had never witnessed anything like this. This wasn't just talent. This wasn't even genius. This was something else entirely. "Samuel," she said carefully, "when you say your other life, what do you mean?" The 4-year-old looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his years. "Before I was born this time, when I lived in a different place, when I had a different mama and papa, when music was my whole life and everyone knew my name." "What was your name in that other life?" Samuel didn't hesitate. "Wolfgang." The room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Morrison had been in music education long enough to know Mozart's full name, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But she didn't want to lead the child. "Wolfgang," she repeated. "And where did you live?" "In Salzburg first when I was very small. Then we traveled everywhere. Papa took me and Nannerl to play for important people. Then later I lived in Vienna. I loved Vienna, but I was always poor there. I wrote so much music, but I never had enough money. And then I got sick. And I died before I could finish my Requiem." Dr. Morrison felt goosebumps rise on her arms. The details Samuel was mentioning, Salzburg, a sister named Nannerl, traveling as a child prodigy, financial struggles in Vienna, the unfinished Requiem. These were all accurate details of Mozart's life. But how could a 4-year-old from Portland, Oregon possibly know these things? She looked at Michael and Jennifer. Has he had access to documentaries about Mozart? Books? Movies? Jennifer shook her head firmly. We don't watch classical music documentaries. We've never shown him anything about Mozart. We didn't even know who Mozart really was until Samuel started talking about him. Dr. Morrison made a decision that day that would set Samuel's life on a very different path. She contacted her former colleague, Dr. Richard Stevenson, a musicologist and researcher who had spent years studying cases of unusual musical ability. Dr. Stevenson drove up from San Francisco to meet Samuel. He brought with him recording equipment, detailed biographical information about Mozart, and a healthy dose of skepticism. He had investigated dozens of child prodigy cases over his career. Most of them turned out to have perfectly rational explanations. But Samuel Bennett was different from anything he had encountered before. Dr. Stevenson's first interview with Samuel took place in November 2014. He set up cameras in the Bennett living room and spent 3 hours talking with the 4-year-old boy. He used a technique he had developed over years of research, asking highly specific questions about Mozart's life that weren't commonly known. Samuel, can you tell me about your house in Salzburg, the one where you lived as a child? Samuel closed his eyes as if trying to picture something from long ago. It was on Getreidegasse, a tall yellow building. We lived on the 3rd floor. The stairs were very narrow and made of stone. My room was small, and I shared it with Nannerl. We had a clavichord there. From the window, I could see the fortress on the hill. Mama said it protected our city. Dr. Stevenson felt his skepticism beginning to crack. The Mozart family home was, indeed, on Getreidegasse in Salzburg's Old Town. The building was yellow. They had lived on the 3rd floor. The apartment had narrow stone stairs. Young Wolfgang had shared a room with his sister. There had been a clavichord, and from the windows you could see Hohensalzburg Fortress on the hill. These weren't details that a 4-year-old would know. These were specifics that required either deep research into Mozart's early life or something else entirely. Tell me about your sister. What was she like? Samuel's face brightened. Nannerl. She was 5 years older than me. She could play so beautifully. Papa taught her first, and I learned by watching her. But Papa said girls couldn't be professional musicians, which made me so sad. Nannerl was as good as me, maybe better, but she never got to travel and play like I did after we grew up. She got married and had to stop playing so much. I missed her when I moved to Vienna. Dr. Stevenson checked his notes. Maria Anna Mozart, nicknamed Nannerl, was indeed 5 years older than Wolfgang. She was an accomplished musician who had to give up her public musical career when she married. Wolfgang and Nannerl had been very close. Every detail matched perfectly. Samuel, you mentioned Papa. What was his name? Leopold. Papa Leopold. He was very strict. He taught me everything about music, but sometimes he was too hard on me. He wanted me to be perfect always. He organized all our tours when I was little. Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang's father, a strict disciplinarian, a talented musician himself. The complicated father-son relationship Samuel described matched historical accounts. Dr. Stevenson decided to dig deeper. Can you tell me about a time when something embarrassing happened while you were performing? Samuel's expression changed. He looked uncomfortable. I don't like to remember that. It was in Vienna. I was playing for Empress Maria Theresa. I was very small, maybe 6 or 7. I was running around the palace because I was excited, and I slipped on the polished floor. I fell down, and a little girl helped me up. Her name was Marie Antoinette. She was kind to me. I told her I would marry her someday, and everyone laughed. I felt so embarrassed. Dr. Stevenson's pen stopped moving. This was a famous anecdote from Mozart's childhood. In 1762, 6-year-old Wolfgang had slipped on the polished floor at Schönbrunn Palace. Marie Antoinette, then a young archduchess, had helped him up. Mozart had declared he would marry her, to everyone's amusement. This wasn't a story in children's books. This was a relatively obscure historical anecdote that required deep research into Mozart's early biography. Over the next 2 years, Dr. Stevenson conducted regular interviews with Samuel, tested the boy's knowledge of Mozart's life repeatedly. But every time, Samuel provided details that were accurate, specific, and often emotionally resonant. Samuel talked about Leopold's disappointment when Wolfgang chose to leave Salzburg for Vienna. He described Archbishop Colloredo, who employed him in Salzburg, as a terrible man who treated me like a servant. He described his meeting with Constanze Weber, the woman who would become Mozart's wife. I loved her so much, but her mother didn't like me. Mama Weber thought I was too poor, too unreliable. But Constanze saw me. She really saw me. She understood my music. We got married even though everyone said we shouldn't. Samuel's eyes would sometimes fill with tears when he talked about his life as Mozart. He described the constant financial struggles, the desperation of trying to compose enough music to pay rent, the frustration of seeing less talented composers achieve greater financial success. I wrote so much beautiful music, but I was always poor. I had to borrow money from friends. Sometimes Constanze and I didn't have enough to eat. But I couldn't stop writing music. The music was inside me. It had to come out. Even when I was sick, even when I was dying, I was still trying to write. He talked about the Requiem, Mozart's final, unfinished masterpiece. A man in gray came to my door. He commissioned the Requiem, but he wouldn't tell me who it was for. I was so sick by then, I knew I was dying. I worked on the Requiem as much as I could, but my hands wouldn't work right. I was so cold all the time. I couldn't finish it. That was my biggest regret. The mysterious gray messenger who commissioned the Requiem was a real historical figure. In 1791, Count Franz von Walsegg had anonymously commissioned Mozart to write a Requiem Mass. Mozart, already ill, became obsessed with completing it, but died before he could finish. But Samuel's knowledge went beyond biographical facts. He had musical knowledge that seemed equally impossible. Dr. Morrison continued working with Samuel and documented something extraordinary. Samuel could play pieces by Mozart that he had never heard before. When she brought obscure Mozart compositions, Samuel could sight read them instantly, playing them with perfect understanding of style. More remarkably, Samuel would sometimes correct the sheet music. He would play a passage differently than written and say, "That's how I meant it to sound. The copyist made a mistake." When Dr. Morrison checked historical musicological research, she found that scholars had indeed identified copyist errors in those exact passages. Samuel also demonstrated an ability that baffled everyone who witnessed it. He could improvise in perfect classical period style. When Dr. Morrison would give him a simple melody, Samuel would create elaborate variations in the exact style of 18th century Viennese composition. "It's like watching someone speak fluent Latin," Dr. Morrison told Dr. Stevenson. Not learned Latin, but native Latin. His musical vocabulary, his harmonic choices, his phrasing, it's all authentic 18th century classical style. I've spent my entire career studying this period, and I can't improvise like he does." In 2016, when Samuel was 6 years old, Dr. Stevenson arranged for him to be interviewed by Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who had spent decades researching children who claimed to remember past lives. Dr. Tucker flew to Portland and spent several days with Samuel. He conducted extensive interviews, not just with Samuel, but with the entire family. He checked for any possible normal explanations. He found nothing that could explain Samuel's knowledge. Dr. Tucker then did something he had done in hundreds of other cases. He created a detailed list of specific claims Samuel had made about Mozart's life. There were 127 specific factual claims in total. Dr. Tucker verified each claim against historical records, Mozart biographies, and scholarly research. The results were stunning. Of the 127 specific claims Samuel had made, 119 were verified as completely accurate. 5 were impossible to verify because historical records were incomplete. Only 3 were potentially inaccurate. This was an extraordinarily high accuracy rate. Samuel's accuracy rate was over 93%. But numbers and verification only told part of the story. What struck Dr. Tucker most was the emotional authenticity of Samuel's memories. When Samuel talked about Mozart's life, he didn't sound like a child reciting facts. He sounded like someone remembering their own life, with all the emotional complexity that comes with real, lived experience. In 2017, a remarkable opportunity arose. The Mozarteum Foundation in Salzburg, Austria, invited Samuel and his family to visit. They wanted to see if Samuel would recognize anything, if being in Mozart's actual childhood home would trigger responses. The Bennett family's trip to Salzburg in summer 2017 would provide some of the most compelling evidence yet. The flight from Portland to Austria took almost 15 hours. 7-year-old Samuel sat quietly for most of the journey, his face pressed against the airplane window. As they descended toward Salzburg, Samuel suddenly became agitated. He pressed his hands against the window. "I can see the fortress! I can see Hohensalzburg! We're almost home!" Jennifer reached over and squeezed her son's hand. The word home sent chills through her. They were arriving in a city Samuel had never visited before in his current life, yet he called it home. The foundation had arranged for them to stay in a hotel in Salzburg's Old Town. Dr. Stevenson accompanied them, along with a documentary crew. The foundation had also invited Dr. Johannes Honzig, a leading Mozart scholar and curator, to observe Samuel's reactions. On their first morning, they walked toward Getreidegasse. The plan was to approach casually, to see if Samuel recognized anything without being prompted. They entered the old town through one of the medieval gates. Samuel suddenly stopped walking. He stood frozen in the middle of the street, looking around with wide eyes. Tears began streaming down his face. "Samuel, what's wrong?" Michael knelt beside his son. "Nothing's wrong, Papa. I just remember this. I remember these streets. That church. We went there with Mama and Nannerl. And that building. There was a bakery there. We would buy bread there when I was little." Dr. Honzig checked his historical notes. There had indeed been a bakery in that building in the 18th century. The church Samuel pointed to was the cathedral where the Mozart family had worshipped. They continued walking, letting Samuel lead the way. Without any directions, without any map, Samuel turned onto Getreidegasse. He walked directly to number 9 and stopped in front of the yellow building, looking up at its windows. "This is it," he said softly. "This is where I lived." The camera crew captured every moment as the foundation's director, Dr. Matthias Schmidt, opened the door and welcomed them inside. The ground floor now housed a museum, but the family apartment on the third floor had been preserved. They climbed the narrow stone staircase. With each step, Samuel's breathing became faster. His hands trembled. When they reached the third floor apartment, Dr. Schmidt opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Samuel to enter first. The boy walked through the doorway and stopped, his body rigid. He looked around the preserved rooms. Then, Samuel did something that made everyone catch their breath. He walked directly to a corner of the music room, to a spot near the window, and knelt down. He ran his hands over the wooden floorboards. "I hid something here once. A little wooden horse that Papa gave me. I was afraid Nannerl would take it, so I hid it between these floorboards. There was a loose board right here." He pressed on a section of floor. Dr. Honzig looked at Dr. Schmidt with raised eyebrows. After a moment's hesitation, Dr. Schmidt nodded. They carefully lifted the floorboard Samuel had indicated. Underneath, in the gap between the floor joists, was a small, weathered wooden horse. It had clearly been there for centuries. The room went silent. No one had known that was there. The building had been restored multiple times over the centuries, but apparently this small, hidden object had never been found. Until now. Until Samuel pointed directly to it. Dr. Honzig picked up the small carved horse with trembling hands. "How did you know this was here?" Samuel looked at the toy with sad eyes. "Because I put it there, a long, long time ago, when I was little, Wolfgang." The documentary crew captured the moment. Later, when the footage aired, it would become one of the most watched segments. Dr. Schmidt and Dr. Honzig both signed affidavits stating they had no knowledge of anything hidden in that location. Samuel spent hours in the apartment that day. He walked through each room, touching walls, looking out windows. In the small bedroom, he stood for a long time, his hand on the wall. Nannerl slept on that side. I slept on that side. In the winter, it was so cold. We would huddle together to stay warm. Mama would bring us hot bricks wrapped in cloth to put in our bed. I would lie awake at night, and music would play in my head. So much music. I couldn't sleep because the melodies wouldn't stop. From Salzburg, they traveled to Vienna. If Salzburg was Wolfgang's childhood home, Vienna was where he had become Mozart. It was also where he had struggled, suffered, and died. The moment they arrived in Vienna, Samuel's demeanor changed. He was no longer the excited child who had recognized his childhood home. He was quieter, more withdrawn, almost melancholy. As they drove through city streets, he would point out places. There used to be a coffee house there. That building? I performed there once. Down that street, that's where Constanze and I lived for a while. They visited the Theater an der Wien, where the Magic Flute had premiered in 1791, just months before Mozart's death. Standing in the historic theater, Samuel said quietly, "This was my last great success. The people loved it. They finally loved my work the way I always hoped they would. But I was so sick by then. I could barely conduct. I knew I was dying." At St. Stephen's Cathedral, where Mozart had married Constanze Weber in 1782, Samuel stood before the altar with a complicated expression. "We were so young. We thought love would be enough. We didn't know how hard things would be. But I never stopped loving her. Even when we had no money, even when I was failing, even when everything was falling apart, I loved her." The most difficult visit was to the Vienna Central Cemetery, where a memorial to Mozart stands. Samuel stood before the memorial monument for a long time, staring at the name carved in stone. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791. 35 years, he said softly. That's all I got. 35 years, and I tried to fit a lifetime of music into it. I wrote over 600 works, symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music, church music, so much music. But it was never enough. There was always more inside me, always more I wanted to write. And then I ran out of time. He turned to Dr. Stevenson. Do you know what the worst part was? Not the poverty, not the sickness. It was knowing that I had more music inside me that would never be heard. Music that died with me. That's why I'm glad I came back. I get another chance. I can write more music now. By 2019, when Samuel was 9 years old, his skill level had reached a point where he was ready to perform publicly at a professional level. After months of planning, the Mozarteum University in Salzburg extended an invitation. They invited Samuel to perform a recital at the Mozarteum in the very city where Wolfgang had been born. It would be Samuel's official debut as a serious pianist. The night before the performance, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of their hotel room, looking out at the illuminated Hohensalzburg fortress on the hill. Are you nervous? His father asked. Samuel thought for a moment. Yes and no. Samuel is nervous, but Wolfgang isn't. Wolfgang has played for kings and queens. Wolfgang knows how to do this. And which one is playing tomorrow? Samuel smiled. Both. We're the same person now, Papa. I'm not possessed by Mozart's ghost. I am him, just in a new life. Everything he knew, everything he felt, it's still here inside me. I've just been given another chance. The next evening, the concert hall was packed. Word had spread internationally about the 9-year-old boy who claimed to be Mozart reincarnated. Journalists from around the world attended. But most importantly, serious musicians and Mozart scholars filled the seats. As Samuel walked onto the stage, he seemed tiny against the massive concert grand piano. He wore formal concert attire. He sat at the piano bench and adjusted its height. For a moment, he just sat there, hands in his lap, staring at the keys. Then he placed his hands on the keyboard and began to play Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11 in A major, the famous sonata that includes the Turkish March. Within seconds, everyone in the hall recognized that something special was happening. This wasn't a talented 9-year-old playing Mozart. This was Mozart being played the way Mozart himself might have played it. The phrasing was perfect. The touch was exquisite. The musical understanding was profound. For the next hour, Samuel performed flawlessly. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood, some with tears streaming down their faces. The ovation continued for more than 10 minutes. In the front row, Dr. Hansig, the Mozart scholar, was wiping his eyes. Next to him, Dr. Morrison was openly crying. They had both dedicated their lives to Mozart's music, and they had just heard those compositions played by someone who seemed to understand them from the inside. After the concert, Dr. Hansig approached Samuel. The distinguished scholar who had spent 40 years studying Mozart knelt down to the 9-year-old's level. Samuel, I have spent my entire career trying to understand Mozart. Tonight, I feel I finally met him. Thank you for that gift. Samuel smiled. You're welcome, sir. And thank you for taking care of my music all these years, for making sure people still play it, still love it. That means everything to me. Samuel's story raises profound questions about consciousness, identity, and existence itself. Is consciousness solely a product of brain activity, or is it something more fundamental? Can skills, memories, and personality traits transfer from one life to another? Samuel himself has a simple view. I don't know how it works. I just know what I remember. I was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I lived, I struggled, I loved, and I died. And then somehow I was born again as Samuel. I'm grateful. I get to live again. I get to make music again. That's all that matters. Whether you believe Samuel's memories are genuine reincarnation or something else entirely, one thing is undeniable. His story captures something we all long to believe, that consciousness is more than neurons firing, that genius and creativity might transcend individual lives, that death might not be the absolute ending we fear. The music continues, and perhaps in ways we don't fully understand, so do we.